Welcome back to Worship Musician Training. This is a little bonus episode, and it's a bonus episode because I forgot to include it when I was making this series initially. But it really is a need-to-know kind of thing. We're talking about intervals here. Intervals, you need to know intervals, and the reason why you need to know intervals is because you have to be able to relate or apply the music theory, the mental, you're kind of learning all of these things about scales, chords, and so on. You need some way to apply that to your instrument, whether it's a guitar or a piano or your voice. What is an interval? An interval, I mentioned this briefly before in the scales and chords videos in this series. Interval is the space between two notes. Steps, you build scales. Skips, you build chords. Those are kinds of intervals. We measure intervals in half steps. There are 12 half steps in an octave. We have two different kinds of intervals, generic and specific intervals. A generic interval is like a step or a skip. It doesn't tell you anything about it. You have to know the context of the scale to know what are those two notes that this step refers to or skip refers to. It's in the C major scale, just to keep it nice and simple, a step from C is D. And how many half steps is that? 2. But a step from E to F is 1 half step. It's still a step. So generic intervals, we usually name them in numbers. So unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, octave, and we can even go beyond into chord theory, where we're naming ninths, 11ths, 13ths, and we think about 15ths sometimes for piano players specifically. But the number name is the generic interval name. A specific interval takes into account the exact number of half steps and applies another name to it. And that name is the interval's quality. There are perfect intervals, there are major intervals, minor intervals, augmented, and diminished intervals. Those are the 5 qualities of interval. And those intervals, when you pair them with a generic number name, will tell you the exact number of half steps that is between those two notes in that interval. Right, and we're going to talk about how that applies in scales. We start with a second, or let's start with unison, right? A unison is 0 half steps. It's like going from C to C in the exact same octave. It's 0 half steps. You're not moving at all. You're playing the same note twice in a row. That is a unison. Then we go to the second, which is, there again, 2 qualities of the second that we'll think about. The minor second is 1 half step. The major second is 2 half steps. We go to the third. Minor third is 3 half steps, 1 half step larger than the major second. The major third is 4 half steps, 1 half step larger than the minor third. And then we jump down again to another perfect interval. The fourth has 5 half steps. And we skip over the 6th half steps. I'm going to talk about that briefly. That has to do with those diminished and augmented intervals. Then we go to the perfect fifth, which is 7 half steps. The minor 6th, 8, major 6th, 9, minor 7th, 10, major 7th, 11, and then we're at the octave, 12 half steps. These are the intervals. All of these intervals will be used by you when you are learning your instrument, when you are learning to play in all 15 keys. You are going to use every single one of these intervals to relate a scale to your instrument, to relate a chord to your instrument. So you'll need to know how all of these intervals are measured and how to name them, how to recognize them in a scale, in a chord, to apply it again to your instrument. Okay. Right, so let's go to inversions. So I've got here the circle of the musical alphabet. And in red, I've got the natural notes, and these blue dashes between the natural notes here are the sharps and the flats, the black keys on the piano. We go clockwise around to get sharp notes. We go counterclockwise to get flat notes. There we go. I've got two notes circled here. I've got this note A and this sharp flat note here between C and D. Let's call it C sharp. What is the specific interval between A and C sharp? We can count it. The number of half steps between every single note between these two notes right here. So there's this half step between A and A sharp. There's this half step between A sharp and B, and so on and so forth. B to C, C to C sharp. That's 4 half steps. That's a major third. We know that it's a third because the generic interval is a third. This is the first note, so this is the second note. So C is the third note. Since this is C sharp, we are naming this after the note name C, which is the third note after A. So it's a third. And we know that it's a major third because it's 4 half steps, and that's the measurement for a major third. That is A ascending to C sharp. Now, what if we descend from A to C sharp? Now we have a minor sixth. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 half steps. 8 half steps is a minor sixth. There are a couple different rules about how intervals invert. And it relates directly to chord inversions, which you're going to be learning on your instrument. These are the same two notes, but two intervals, because it's two different distances, two different numbers of half steps, 4 and 8. Well, the first thing to notice is that 4 plus 8 is 12, and there's 12 half steps in an octave. So it makes sense that if you add the interval from this side with the interval from this side, that number is always going to equal 12. The major part became minor when we went counterclockwise. So a major interval will always invert as a minor interval. And a perfect interval, say if it was A to E, that is a perfect fifth, ascending, but it's a perfect fourth if we descend to E from A. A perfect interval will always invert as another perfect interval. Augmented intervals and diminished intervals will invert with each other as well. Major and minor invert with each other. Perfect inverts as itself. Right. And so that's pretty simple. There's lots of different ways you can apply this and use this to practice. But it really is just kind of a long process of learning your scales and learning your scales. You can learn the scale and the notes that are in it. But do you know the interval from the second note to the fourth note in the scale? You might know the interval from the first note to the fourth note, but what about the sixth note to the fourth note, right? And how does that invert when you're going to use that in a chord? It's probably going to be a 4 chord in that case. Right. And that is all super relevant when you're applying it to an instrument, especially a guitar or bass, especially to voice, especially to piano, especially to every instrument. Lastly, I want to touch on the tritone, and just really briefly. This is where augmented and diminished intervals come in. In a major scale, it's a diminished fifth. In another kind of scale, like a Lydian mode, it will be an augmented fourth. But the tritone is always 6 half steps. That's our missing 6 half steps from over here. We don't use this interval of a tritone in worship music, basically ever. It's basically non-existent, and there's lots of different reasons for that, but that's not what this video is about. The main takeaway is that we won't see any augmented or diminished intervals in a worship song, 99.99% of the time. There we go. Intervals. Learn them. Use them to apply the knowledge that you've gained through this series to your instrument. You will need to do that.